Hey, welcome back to the Mining Pod. We're going to talk about the US CBP. We're going to be talking about Bitcoin miners having their units seized. And we're going to talk about how this all relates to the new Trump administration right after a word from our sponsors.
Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com.
Today's show is brought to you by Digital Shovel. Digital Shovel is a leading manufacturer of modular mining pods as well as PDUs and switchgears. Unlike many other competitors, their product is designed and manufactured in North America with a complete UL inspection on the entire unit, not just individual components. Additionally, Digital Shovel is one of the most vertically integrated manufacturers of over 75,000 square feet of sheet metal shop, SMT and wave solder PCB assembly, as well as final assembly all under one roof in Toronto, Canada. Their price point leads the industry when compared to products with rates as low as $69,000 per megawatt for a complete data center with smart PDUs and switchgears. To learn more, visit digitalshovel.com.
Okay, Colin and I are back from a weekend. We're energized, we're caffeinated, and we are ready to do a short podcast this Monday morning. This will be coming out early Eastern hours. And we're talking about the US CBP, US Customs Border Protection Agency, that was seizing Bitcoin miners from private, public brokers. We broke this news on Blockspace about 2 weeks ago. We had a first reporting about it in September of last year. But new reports from brokers and other people in the space indicate that the US CBP is now starting to release these Bitcoin miners, likely due to lobbyist pressure from Bitcoin miners themselves. So we're going to get into this, that, and the other thing. Colin, I'll hand it to you first, just to give kind of some of the information we're getting from our sources right now. And then over the course of the podcast, we'll go back through the history of what happened, some reflections on why this could have happened. And then my favorite part at the end, we're going to go through some conspiracies of what is actually happening or could be happening.
Yeah, a lot of unanswered questions. One of the more interesting stories that has hit our radar, I think, over the last year, and it's developed in stages, like Will said, and we'll go over these stages chronologically more in depth throughout the podcast. But all of this started last September and October with detentions of ASIC miners, specifically Antminer units, the T21 and S21 series. It escalated recently in February with actual seizures. One company we spoke to had $5 million worth of hardware seized. And now, as Will said, we're starting to hear reports of some of these ASIC imports being released. This is happening kind of on a piecemeal basis. Some miners have not had their ASICs released yet, but they are anticipating that should happen soon. Others have already had notices from the CBP that their ASICs have been released. So I think the important thing to note on this escalation, just a few kind of highlights. The first round of detentions back in September and October were targeted specifically towards Antminer ASICs. And like specifically, I said, those T21 and S21 series. And part of the speculation as to why is because the T21 uses a softgo chip for its control boards in certain units. ASIC miners use a number of different control boards. That's kind of just a supply chain thing, right? The ASIC manufacturers source parts from all these different suppliers to make sure that they can actually have enough for the units that they create. And some of these control boards had softgo chips. Now, why does that matter? Because softgo is blacklisted currently by the US Department of Commerce because of its relationship with Huawei. Apparently, Huawei, which has been sanctioned since 2019, was using some softgo chips in some of its hardware. And softgo also notably shares a CEO and co-founder with Bitmain in one McCree Zan. So that was the speculation for the first round of these detentions that, okay, well, the T21 uses the softgo chip. Maybe they're trying to control for that. Maybe they're worried about sanctions violations or trade violations with that. Still strange considering this has never happened before, but you could almost give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt with regards to this being a kind of very focused detention for those units specifically. But the most recent round of detentions, which also escalated to seizures for Antminer ASICs, right? Multiple sources we talked to not just had their imports held at the border, they actually had the hardware seized by the government, by the Customs Border Protection Agency. But in addition to that, more than Antminer, you started seeing Whatsminer and Canaan ASICs also being detained at the border, which was a first. And the scope of the detentions were broadened to multiple ports of entry across the US. Before, it was really the two cities we heard having the most detentions or really being the focus of it were Detroit and San Francisco. And in the most recent round, you started seeing a number of detentions happening. Now, one last thing before we hop into the chronology. We originally reported that we had only heard of Antminers being held at the border. Some reporting from our friends at the Miner Mag from Wolfie Zhao kind of shows that potentially this could have been broader than Antminers at the onset. So this is a article that Wolfie wrote about Begin Blockchain. I've never heard of them. They're an altcoin ASIC manufacturer specifically for the Caspa blockchain. And anyway, they reported in one of their filings, because they're prospectively IPOing soon, that they had roughly 2,400 units detained at the US border as of September 2024. So the original scope of this could have been broader than we originally reported on, because we were working with just, we had, I think, roughly 10, maybe a dozen sources over the course of our reporting, some of whom were public miners, some of whom were large ASIC brokers in the US. But this could have been larger at the beginning than just Antminer ASICs. And obviously, it's been much larger now. But important thing to note is that now some of these units are being released. Obviously, not all of them have been released. We're still having reports coming in from various sources, but they have only started being released after these miners kind of banded together and lobbied multiple, friends on Capitol Hill, we should say, or various government officials across the executive and legislative branches of government for this action to end. So applying a little pressure, it apparently worked. And we'll kind of get into, in the conspiracy corner, just exactly why that pressure had to be applied and, whether or not some of these allies were thrilled about this kind of action to begin with. So
yeah, Miners Peak, which is a really popular Telegram chat for North American-based Bitcoin miners, has been awash in complaints. I have tons of different private miners in that chat, and I won't dox anybody, even though it is a public chat, but there's a lot of interest in learning more about this because so many private miners are having shipments and pallets seized or temporarily detained. You're not really able to get them across the border. Sometimes they're sent back to Asia where they came from. And then in some instances, they're just like held, right? And so for smaller guys who are shipping, a few pallets, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, upwards to millions of dollars of equipment. And they're sort of stuck in limbo where maybe they didn't have insurance for these units. Sidebar, if you do need insurance and you're listening to this, give us a text and we are happy to put you in touch with some of the insurance agents that we know of in the space that are highly reputable. This is a huge problem for the mining industry as of now because it's going to delay growth. For the public guys, this could get kind of bad if they have to disclose this. So you notice that it was disclosed in this IPO, right? But what if Amara or a CleanSpark or someone else has to disclose that they have a ton of their hash rate for their forward guidance locked in some border patrol, border protection office agency hut, on the Canadian border or like in Los Angeles? Luckily, though, it does seem to be breaking. We've had enough reports from various brokers, both public and private, to indicate that this is going to start moving forward and start trickling out. So Colin, do you mind if I move us forward to the next part? We start talking about some of the things that we've learned recently.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we talked to a lot of different miners over the last, say, 3 to 4 days about their problems with this. And the thing that we're seeing across the board is that there was numerous agencies involved. There was pressure applied all the way up from the Senate to the White House and every agency in between, and that tons of lawyers from the big guys were getting involved, including some of the big guys kind of working together. So, of course, we're not going to name names for this. A lot of our sourcing has been on background, as a lot of our sourcing has been for Blockspace. Just for our editorial sense, we use at least 2 sources, and we try to work with hard documents. In this case, we did get some hard documents to kind of show that things are easing, which is nice. it looks like the best help came from Senator Lummis's office and also from the White House. Now, the White House angle is really important here. I think the Senator Lummis angle makes sense, right? Wyoming has Hashrate. She's been a huge advocate for Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. It makes sense for people to reach out to her and sort of kind of get the ball moving. But the White House is the interesting angle, right? Because the Bitcoin miners, few of them did go to Mar-a-Lago and sort of work with Trump before the election in order to fund his campaign and get some kind of rub elbows with him. And it looks like they were able to cash in that chip earlier than expected and able to go to him and be like, hey, we need help with this. So who knows how far this went up the totem pole, if Trump was even aware of it. But it does look like the White House was instrumental in order to get this moved forward. But I also know that there are some other regulatory agencies, including the FCC and the CBP, which obviously the CBP is the center of this, and the FCC was in the middle of our reporting. But those agencies were involved with this, and things are now moving forward. Just the Trump stuff is notable. I think the fact that Bitcoin miners have enough cash to be able to sort of push on that to get things done. And I would assume that it means like the public miners are getting involved with this, right? Because they just like can't have
100%
that much delays compared. The private guys, unfortunately, like the best they can kind of do is get lawyers and start moving up the regulatory stack and maybe move through the courts. But that could take forever and you might run out of money by then. So, you know, it does pay to play the fiat game here.
Big players in Bitcoin mining demand stability, regulation, and trust. That's why Nicehash has moved its headquarters to Switzerland, a country known for its strong regulatory framework and for keeping its cheese locked in a safe. As one of the most regulated mining platforms in the industry, Nicehash provides institutional miners with a secure, compliant, and transparent solution to manage and maximize their mining output, delivering the reliability and performance expected from the best mining pools, along with firmware, monitoring software, and other essential mining tools. Contact a Nicehash representative today to learn why the top Bitcoin miners are making the switch to Nicehash. You can find out more info in today's show notes. And when you contact them, let them know the Mining Pod sent you.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction too, that the larger miners, especially the public ones who are getting to be powerful, right? I mean, they're not like a Magnificent Seven company at all, but they still are starting to have a larger voice on Capitol Hill. A lot of them have general counsels that are plugged in to what's going on policy-wise, right? And so they're going to be the loudest voices for this, and they're going to be the ones who reach officials first. And it's important too, what you mentioned about their forward guidance for hash rate, right? This completely disrupted a lot of forward guidance for some of these miners who are promising X amount of exahashes to be online over X time frame, right? And so they have a vested interest to get this solved as quickly as possible, and they're the ones who are going to be able to get there first. This is another example of the growing influence of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency companies within the national conversation and on the national stage with regards to politics, right? Again, I don't want to overstate it because it's not like they're traditional tech companies at this point where they can snap their fingers and have the ear of people on Capitol Hill, but they are starting to have greater influence. And to your point, the Bitcoin coalition was a large part of, I won't say a large part of why Trump got elected, but it was a significant voter base. And he made efforts to appeal to this voter base throughout his campaign, right? He went and keynoted at Bitcoin 2024. The reason why this is so strange to be happening currently, especially the ramping up, right, is it flies in the face of everything that Trump promised when he was coming into office, right? I'm going to treat your industry better. You know, I'm going to fire Gary Gensler, all of these kind of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency dog whistles, so to speak, that really appealed to an industry that has really only been used to government scrutiny at best and hostility at worst, right? So we wrote a note about this in our newsletter a few weeks ago, and I said, what gives? I thought Trump was supposed to be good for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And that kind of lies at the heart of this, because as far as we can tell from what we've sourced from the affected miners, this was not a Trump White House directive, allegedly. We cannot prove that right now. We would really like to hop on the horn with someone in the government to ask them some questions about this. But on the surface, it doesn't look like this was something that was escalated due to a Trump White House directive. So where did this all start? This all started, as we said earlier, in really October or September. We reported on it in November that the CBP was halting ASICs at the border at the behest of the FCC. Now, this is really important because we were originally told by some of the miners affected that the CBP had directly told them that the FCC was giving them the directive to hold these miners. Now, why does the FCC have any authority here in the first place? Well, they're the Federal Communications Commission, and they oversee things like radios and other communications devices, which include computers at this point, right? Kind of one of those things where it seemed like an antiquated agency for a new age technology. And they're just kind of like, okay, well, you have control over this thing. This is your directive at this point. And as we highlight here, FCC said that this was something that they are directing. Now, fast forward to the ramp up that we reported on in February, and the CBP, in one of the documents sent to a miner who had their assets seized, cited a U.S. legal code provision that cites sections of the provision that pertain to unauthorized communications equipment, radio frequency equipment that causes interference, and equipment that is not FCC approved or compliant with the agency's rules. Now, this is also important because this kind of corroborates what we heard at first, right? That the FCC was potentially giving this directive. And here the CBP is citing that this equipment could be in direct conflict with FCC approval and the agency's rules, right? Now, this gets tricky when we look at a FOIA request that was answered by the FCC that Blockspace submitted. They basically said in this FOIA that they were unaware of any directive from the FCC, any memos, any emails. They couldn't find any communication in the FCC to the CBP asking for these seizures and these holds. When I got this, I was really scratching my head. I didn't know what to make of it because we reviewed documents from some of these sources where the CBP literally said the FCC asked us to do this. But now with our new reporting, we heard from certain sources that actually this was never an FCC directive at all, and that the CBP was driving most of this. And so that's the biggest outstanding question for me is where does this all come from? And we had a number of sources kind of give us some theories, Will. I don't know how rooted those are in reality and how much they know for certain, but there are a few kind of theories or ideas floating around as to where this might have surfaced from.
Yeah, and we can get into the conspiracy corner. The background's super helpful. I want to move to reflections if you're good with that, and just talk about what does this mean. So a few thoughts, like what does this mean for silicon in the US? Obviously, there's the Arizona plant with TSMC that's being built, and there's sort of like this background story with Trump pushing on TSMC and pushing for sort of TSMC to bend the knee to Trump. So that's a story here we should be mindful of. Miners wanting a US-based company to service chips. We have Bitdeer, Block, Auradine, all producing machines here in the United States or going to start assembling them in the United States. And do miners want more than just the assembly, right? Do they want the silicon itself to be produced in the United States all the way up to the form factor? Is that going to be a thing? I think some miners are going to want that, and they're not going to be comfortable with like just this sort of in-between thing where, yeah, we create it in Malaysia and then we ship it over and then assemble it in the United States. I mean, that's how Toyota does it for like a lot of their parts, right? Like they ship the car to Mexico and then it's passed over the border unassembled. And then once it gets on the other side of Tijuana, they assemble it, right? And so that's how a lot of manufacturers get around these tariffs. And maybe Bitcoin miners aren't good with that anymore because there's this aspect in the background with these seizures that are quite expensive. So that's another thought I had. Might want more than just being assembled in the United States, as a lot of current units are. And then there's also like the last question for Bitmain. What does this do for Bitmain? We know that they announced that they're going to have a larger US presence in 2025 with a new manufacturing plant. So the manufacturing plant was an assembly. Can't quite remember, Colin.
Well, I mean, I think those things are kind of synonyms, right? So it would be an assembly plant for the shoebox miners, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think they're not going to be using TSMC's fab in Arizona, but they might start manufacturing the actual miners, the ASIC miners, the full complete units in the US. I've also heard Mexico as well.
Yeah. So that goes back to the assembly story. Is that enough? Or do miners want the whole thing? Built in the United States? And that's an open question. I think just to finish on the Bitmain stuff and give it to you is like, does this scare Bitmain into doing more, to offloading more of its assets? A story that's connected here is the Kango story, right? Where Bitmain built up all this exahash of XPs. They had a glut of XPs. They sold all these units to Kango, and then Kango was already US public stock. And there's a relationship between those two companies now, similar to BitFuFu, where they have a relationship. They sign an exahash deal. They help BitFuFu get off the ground. Is it in Bitmain's best interest to start spinning off certain elements of its business in order to protect itself? I think right now we can probably say that Bitmain's probably fine. Like, it seems to be past this. If we're getting through the tariff issue and if we're getting through these border patrol issues, we're probably fine. But it's still an open question. And from a risk management perspective, if I was in Bitmain, I'd be considering these things.
In the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale, we've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
The Kango thing's super interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it really is a clever way for Bitmain to say, well, we built too many of these XPs where we have power that's a little bit higher than we want to pay for them because they're an older model at this point. Let's just basically sell them to a shell company that we control and start a new public miner and see where it goes. I don't think that the ASIC manufacturing line is going to be as easy to peel off or to how should we say revamp on US soil, right? Because the biggest consideration for, like, let's say full supply chain assembly in the US, and by that I mean you're not necessarily sourcing all of the parts like the chassis and the heat sinks and stuff in the US, but chip to ASIC miner full unit fabrication in the US is going to be much harder. You know, Bitdeer is going to start using the Arizona TMC facility. The nodes for that are only 4 nanometer, right? Bitmain and all these other ASIC manufacturers, except maybe Whatsminer, they might still be using 4 nanometer with Samsung. I don't know if it's 3 yet, but they're all using 3 nanometer from TSMC's Taiwan facilities, right? 3 nanometer is much more efficient. It's going to be more competitive. So that's the biggest, I think, hurdle to adoption of that business model in the US. It's not even the labor costs and things like that. It's like, are the chips that you're going to have in the US are they going to be competitive enough? I do think, though, this does open up conversations for trying to onshore more of this just to de-risk the entire supply chain for these things coming in. I mean, US-based ASICs are carrying a premium to ones that are imported from Southeast Asia right now. And the whole reason for that is not just because of tariff scares. I mean, you know, Trump's going to implement 10% tariffs on China for all goods on top of the 25 to 30% that was already levied during his first term, right? And so it's not just about the tariffs, but it's about the fact that there's been a complete bottleneck for ASICs getting into the country from outside. So that creates a premium for onshore hash rate. I do think that it makes sense for these miners to start figuring out how they can actually manufacture this stuff onshore. And I think that was something that they were already kind of thinking of before. And this probably just is going to catalyze them further towards that point.
Let's jump to the conspiracy corner as we're closing out here. So we only spent a few minutes on this, and some of this is speculative. Some of this is based on just speculative thoughts, I think, from sources, and some is based on sourcing material itself. But why did this happen in the first place? Why did the Biden administration, why was there directives within these internal agencies to start going after Bitcoin miners? Now, we know from our own reporting, talking to the FCC, that there was no internal directive to start seizing Bitcoin mining units. It's We have that in quote. We have that in an email inbox from the FCC at Blockspace. But that doesn't seem to be the case, because certainly that these units were being held up. Thousands of units were being held, and they're held by the CBP. And some of the documentation we have later cites FCC regulations for the reason why that they're being held at the border. So maybe the CBP was just like using that as the rationale, and FCC had no relationship to this. But it certainly leaves an open question there. Why was the Biden administration involved in this in the first place? Why were they interested in this? Why were they going after Bitcoin miners in the closing, waning days of their administration? I mean, it started in September. Maybe this was some sort of punishment for being involved with the Trump campaign, sort of punitive. We've certainly seen that there have been punitive measures against other aspects of the cryptocurrency industry. And the last thought that we'll throw out there for the Biden angle is like, why did this pop back up in January and February this year when most of the stuff initially happened in September and October? There's some thoughts circulating around that perhaps the middle management layer of the CBP was still operating on those directives from the Biden administration, and that the Trump White House did not have time to come in and sort of clean house and put their new people in place. And so the prior directives were still being implemented. This led to some confusion, I think, during the initial reporting around this. And you could even see this in some of the Bloomberg reporting that followed ours, is that they were saying maybe this Bitcoin mining push by the CBP, this anti-Bitcoin mining push by the CBP, was because of the Trump tariffs and because of Trump's rhetoric against China. But that didn't really square very well with our knowledge of the Trump administration courting Bitcoin miners and then being very involved in his campaign. So that kind of left the door open for further questions. And I think that it makes more sense that there was probably just some sort of internal directive that was left over from the last White House, and it was continued on either by rogue employees of the CBP or just it was passive. This is the new directive. These are the new rules as of 2024, and they're being followed into 2025. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, two threads to pluck. And I'll start with, why did this accelerate after there was already a change of the executive, right? That's the most interesting aspect of this to me, right? Because what was happening in September and October of last year, and a lot of those units are still held, right? Like they've not been released. They've been in detention for months. That was one thing. But outright seizing the hardware that's not illegal and has been imported for years, like these ASIC manufacturers are not new, is a really an incredible abuse of power. And why did that escalate after Trump had already taken office? There is a tinfoil hat side of me, right, that wants to say, was this a retaliation method? Basically saying, well, you were an ally to this guy, so screw you, we're going to take your stuff. I have nothing to base that on other than a gut feeling. But I also have Operation Choke Point 2.0 a little bit to base that on, right? Because we know that the Biden administration was using kind of these shadow tactics to debank the cryptocurrency and tech industry for years. How much of that was the same line of thinking, or how much of this was that same line of thinking just applied to crypto and Bitcoin miners, right? Again, I have no hard evidence for this other than just a hunch. I'm just floating the idea out there. And the other thread I wanted to pluck, the idea that this could have been middle management kind of gone awry. Again, this is kind of speculative. We did hear from numerous sources that was their understanding of the situation, that there was no top-down directive. But that doesn't mean that middle management and some of these bureaucracies can't just, basically go around and issue their own edicts for what they want to see happen, right? Like everyone has a boss. So that's the other question I have in all of this. I don't really know how these bureaucracies are structured in terms of chains of command, but I could see a situation very easily where, sure, you didn't have a top-down directive for this, but you did have someone kind of in the middle management of the CBP saying, this is what we're doing. And who knows where they got their orders? Was it a rogue actor kind of just mad and just doing whatever they wanted in the final days of their employment potentially? Or did they actually have a directive from someone higher up in the government that was under the table and not on the record, much like Operation Choke Point 2.0 was? Again, all kind of in the realm of speculation, but I think these are questions that we need to be asking, because this was kind of an unprecedented crackdown on the Bitcoin mining industry in terms of its imports. So it would be great to get to the bottom of it. We'll see what we can do on our follow-up reporting, but I don't think we're going to get answers to this unless there's like a formal inquiry on the government level.
Cool. We'll close it out there. If you are interested in more of this, we'll be following up with a newsletter on Wednesday, newsletter.blockspacemedia.com. You can find the link in the top of the show notes. Just scroll right down and click it there. If you're enjoying the show, be sure to give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and elsewhere. And lastly, a little plug for OpNext, the Bitcoin Scaling Conference. We'll be hosting that outside DC. If you are a DC area Bitcoiner or are interested in different tech and ways to scale Bitcoin, come join us at OpNext. You can join us at opnext.dev and use code BITDEVS, BITDEVS, all caps, for 10% off a general admission ticket. Okay, we'll see you guys later. Peace.